impact of the COVID-19 virus has no doubt shaken the world in a way not seen before, with the tragic loss of life of over 1 million people so far being the heaviest price to pay. Yet for many developing and global South nations, a huge dilemma exists, and it's one that has been created by the richer and global North states who are mostly to blame. So what is the problem? It's having to choose between paying back debts or providing much needed health care, and it's something that major institutions such as the IMF have taken into consideration by asking the lending countries to ease the repayment plans in order for developing nations to concentrate their efforts on problems at home.
I want to finish with the gratitude to the G20 for exceptionally rapid decision on debt relief for the poorest countries. It would release billions of dollars for them. And that is exactly what we need. Solidarity, so we can come through this together.
Yet, there is a huge problem. In spite of the efforts of the lenders to ease repayments, however big or small that may be, there is the issue of how the money being saved is being spent, with allegations emerging that mismanagement and corruptions means the money is not reaching those whom it should be.
Donc, le niveau de mégestion, de mauvaise gouvernance de nos dirigeants nous inquiète, nous préoccupe, et nous, justement, en tant que citoyens, nous allons mettre la pression pour que ces fonds-là, en tout cas, soient alloués pour la résolution de la crise.
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Omid Rochandel, standing in for Kaveh Taghwaei while he covers the U.S. elections on our sister show, Decision 2020. On this week's show, we'll be taking a look at how developing nations are struggling with debt to world institutions and other countries and examining whether debt relief is truly being used to treat other major crises that the world is currently facing. Now, as we always mention, this is your show, so feel free to get involved in the conversation by following us on our Twitter page using the marker ED_program. We always want to hear about the stories that matter to you, so get in touch, and one day we may just cover a story that you send in. Now, let's take a look at some of the examples of why debt relief could help some of the nations in Africa in particular when it comes to dealing with the ongoing medical crisis caused by the coronavirus. Kenya, for example, one of the more developed nations in Africa, only has 150 intensive care beds for a population of 50 million people, raising the question as to just how bad things must be elsewhere across the continent. A shortage of doctors is also a major problem for African nations, with Tanzania, for example, having just one doctor per 70,000 people, and Ghana having less than 15% of the number of doctors it needs. Yet Ghana is currently paying debts of $36.3 million per week, enough to pay salaries of an extra 1,500 doctors per year. Now, taking it one stage further, and nurses are also in dire shortage across Africa, with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, having half the number of nurses it requires, with the amount of debt being paid back in just 4 months of the year, enough to employ a further 141,000 nurses per year in the country. Figures that I'm sure you will all agree are truly startling.
There's no doubt that when it comes to any kind of debt, there's a major common denominator that determines it. Namely, one rich party will lend to a poor party, on the condition of usually high interest rates and some kind of notion of set conditions to pay it back, which for the most part often sees the party owing money, rarely able to fully pay it back, hence finding itself in a position to be exploited. One of the most prominent examples of debt is seen in developing nations who have borrowed vast amounts of money from more developed countries, who in turn use the debt to exploit land, resources and people into paying back the loans. Africa is of course one such place where such debt exists. But how then did African nations find themselves in such positions?
I think one point is that countries are encouraged to borrow. That lenders exist and they want to lend money. The big difference for African countries is whether the borrowing is from multilateral institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, or industrialized countries where it's concessional, or whether it's from the private sector.
When one looks at the statistics for Africa, the figures are truly worrying for the nations, with external debts doubling on average across the continent from 5.9% in 2015 up to 11.8% and rising currently. Of this debt, around 20% of total African debt is owed to China, of which 17% of African government external interest payments alone are paid to the Chinese. However, this only reflects the debts owed to nation states. In fact, the problem is equally big when it comes to private loans, with around 32% of African government external debt being owed to private lenders, and a further 35% being owed to multilateral institutions such as the IMF and World Bank. The demographics of African debt is also an interesting point to discuss, with the whole continent owing around $283 billion. However, 42% of this debt, which equates to around $119 billion, has been loaned to North African countries, with the likes of Egypt, Algeria and Morocco all heavily in debt to lenders.
So how big a problem is debt repayment on a global scale? In 2018, external debt accumulated to a staggering $457 billion. In 2020 alone, the 76 poorest nations in the world are due to pay $40.6 billion, leaving little room for the world's poorest nations to concentrate any of their efforts on fighting and treating the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the start of the pandemic, over $23.5 billion has been repaid by the world's poorest countries to banks and other nations. With the money being spent by poor nations and their debts, it has been calculated that failure to act on the coronavirus could claim 40 million lives worldwide, and for those that survive, 500 million more people could fall into poverty. However, the global debt problem is not just one that affects the poorer nations, with the world's richest nations also seeing themselves plunge into debt, with around $17 trillion worth of extra public debt, which when adjusted to an individual level, could see 1.3 billion people around the world's most developed nations fall $13,000 into debt each as governments raise taxes to repay the debts.
We've already ascertained that poor nations remain poor, partly due to their massive debts owed to lenders. However, there's also a flip side to the coin, namely more developed and richer nations being in debt themselves. Take for example the United States of America, who as things stand, enjoys the title of the world's largest economy. The national debt in the US at the time of writing exceeds $27 trillion, which equates to around $82,500 per person. A quick look at the US national debt website clock will show you just how alarmingly fast the debt is rising. When one looks at some other richer nations around the world, the debt figures are equally shocking, with the average debt versus GDP ratio standing at around 68.9% globally. Broken down, these figures per nation are quite staggering, with China, for example, at 55.6%, the US at 106%, India at 69%, and worst of all, Japan at 237.7% in debt versus its GDP. For many of the other richer nations around the world, the impact of the coronavirus has also added fuel to the fire in many situations, with production and consumption down, leaving the pieces yet to be collected from the spilt puzzle. So will such nations recover when it comes to being in such debt?
The financial institutions are based in the developed countries, the rich countries. So there's greater confidence in the ability of industrialized countries to, at some point in the future, repay the debt. Now, it may be misplaced confidence, and there is an element that, that the huge debt burden that the US has is not really the US's problem, it's everybody else's problem because they've lent it. So, the big countries, especially because they're where the financial institutions are based, they can get away with things that other countries can't manage to get away with.
When one analyses the impact of debt, there's a shocking truth in the matter, namely, where the rich borrow, the poor repay. This is clearly the case in examples seen around the world, with Western or Global North developed nations seeing huge debt crises, much like the one seen in 1982 and 2009. And even throughout the current financial collapse caused by the pandemic, the consequences are often felt by the poorest nations. One of the main causes of such financial crises is the effect it has on poverty in developing nations, as the rich divert their attention towards themselves. According to UNICEF, as a direct result of the financial bubble bursting in the 1980s, over 500,000 children under the age of 5 died each year in Africa and Latin America as a direct result of the debt crisis and its management under the IMF. The Asian crisis threw millions of people into extreme poverty. In Indonesia, for example, over 30 million people dropped below the $1 per day benchmark, resulting in hunger, illness and death. It seems then that the burden of debt affects poorer nations twofold compared to richer nations, as not only do they have to deal with their own financial commitments, but when things go bad elsewhere, it seems that the trickle-down effect ultimately knocks on the door of the poor, leaving the economic divide greater than ever.
It's a great honor to say that joining me in the studio today is Hakim Adi, a professor of the history of Africa and African diaspora from Chichester University. His research entrusts Pan-Africanism to the modern political history of Africa. He was a founder member of the Black and Asian Studies Association, and he also leads the History Matters group. His works include West Africans in Britain from 1900 to 1960 and Pan-Africanism and Communism. He has also worked on the multi-award-winning documentary, 500 Years Later. Professor, many thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
My first question then relates to the position that many African nations find themselves in, namely highly indebted to richer nations and global financial institutions. Can you give our viewers a brief introduction as to how African nations found themselves in this position?
Well, I think the easiest way of understanding that is to think about the colonial period and the kind of economies that most African countries had during that period. And the fact is that even though we're 60 or 70 years after most African countries gained independence, their economies are still geared to generally producing products for export, raw materials of various kinds for export. They're still highly dependent on global markets. They're still highly dependent on an economy which is skewed against them and operates in the favor of the big powers, the G20 countries and others. Many of them are in debt for a variety of reasons. They needed to borrow to produce and develop infrastructural developments of various kinds. And so they're really in a dependent situation with the major economies of the world, the economies of the EU, the US, and other major powers.
Okay, next up then, with the current global coronavirus pandemic having such a devastating effect on the people of the world, how then are nations in Africa coping with the virus? And when it comes to paying back debt, are the lenders giving enough space to African nations to concentrate on dealing with the pandemic as a priority over debt repayment?
Well, I think you could say that most African countries have probably dealt with the COVID pandemic better than some of the wealthier countries. If we think of countries like the US and Britain that haven't coped very well, most African countries, with one or two exceptions, have far fewer cases of the virus and far fewer deaths. Having said that, they still need to apportion some of their budgets to health and other programs of that kind, and so many of them are still struggling. Some have to decide between debt repayments and spending more on health and other forms of social care. So there's still a problem. There have been some efforts by the big lenders, by G20 and others, to mitigate the circumstances regarding debt payments, but for a variety of reasons, most African countries haven't taken up those offers.
And finally, what does the future hold for African nations in a post-pandemic period? As we have seen, there is much interest from nations such as China when it comes to investing in Africa. Is this something that Africa should embrace or, in fact, should be wary of?
I think Africa should be very wary of it. Again, it all depends on the relationship between African countries and lenders. And if that relationship is one of dependency, it's not really a good thing for African countries. It also, of course, depends on what these investments are for, or what African governments are borrowing for. But generally, these kinds of arrangements tend to keep Africa's economies dependent on other countries, whether those are the countries of the West, so-called, the EU, the US, or big emerging powers like China.
Many thanks, Professor Adi from the University of Chichester. It's been great having you on the show.
You're welcome anytime.
Now, if you'd like to know more about Professor Adi, check out this Twitter feed and follow him on Hakeem Adi1 or via his website, www.hakeemadi.org. We're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere as we have plenty more coming up. We're joined by researcher and journalist Atifeh Padidar as she runs us through some of her findings on the topic from the world of social media. We also delve into the global pandemic and ascertain just how bad things are in developing nations around the world, as well as examining whether foreign direct investment is a benefit or a burden to developing nations. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short message.
I'm Lembit Opik, and in this edition of Cats and Dogs, we take a look at the fortunes of sleepy Joe Biden, the president-in-waiting, and a man who's forgotten the colour of his running mate, the name of his opponent, and he thinks Winston Churchill was an American president. Join me, Lembit Opik, for some howling good fun on Cats and Dogs here on Press TV.
We've already touched on the notion that the coronavirus has caused one of the world's worst financial collapses in history, with a real possibility of a global depression on the cards for many nations, and for those that are lucky, maybe just a prolonged recession. But for nations in the global south and still in development, how has the impact of the virus affected them? For a start, with the notion of existing debt hanging over their shoulders, tough choices have had to be made, namely, the choice between paying back debt or paying towards its internal infrastructure, particularly in the field of healthcare, to be able to provide much needed services to the sick and needy. For many African nations, for example, the lack of access to equipment such as ventilators, doctors and other forms of healthcare is a huge dilemma, and one that requires the lenders to waive their fees, hence allowing such nations to concentrate on treating and defeating the virus. When one looks at the current spending on fighting the coronavirus, never more has there been such a time to demand that lenders provide some notion of debt relief to such nations. The average spending in sub-Saharan Africa on fighting the virus is around 0.26% of the GDP, when compared to Europe's 9% and North America's 11.5%. It's significantly lower than needed, raising the question as to just where the money is going otherwise. So what's being done to relieve the debt and reduce poverty? As things stand, out of the world's 28 poorest nations, 27 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, with the region's poverty rating standing at around 42.3%, proving beyond doubt that African nations need debt alleviation. One such solution to the problem is a standstill on the interest being paid out. For many nations, the debt never gets repaid, as the interest on the debt outweighs the initial loan. Providing lenders are willing to waive the interest, the situation could be controlled. Yet, as we all know, the chances of this happening are very low, hence why the rich remain rich and the poor remain poor.
Joining me in the studio today is our journalist and researcher, Atifeh Padidar. Atifeh, many thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I know that many poor nations in the world had already been under severe debts to global institutions and banks before the pandemic hit. And now with coronavirus showing no sign of abating, they are getting more and more indebted to them.
Right, that's what a lot of people on social media were expressing concern about, like this tweet that I picked up. This one is from one campaign. It says, "This big key COVID-19 facts from Africa, 6 months extension of debt service suspension initiative. 65% of countries participating in the DSSI are African. 170 countries have implemented some form of lockdown."
What is DSSI?
Debt service suspension initiative. These countries had to enforce a lot of restrictions and lockdowns that put their businesses in slow motion or in total shutdown, and this had put their interest, they lagged behind their payments, and they couldn't pay their debt to, for example, IMF or World Banks. This is by Global Justice Now Scotland says the World Bank and the IMF have for decades been part of a well-orchestrated scheme to keep previously colonized countries in a never-ending cycle of debt. So this means that previously there were other ways of colonization, and now this is a modern way.
Modern way of that, yeah. Thank you so much, Atafa, for being with us here today again.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you again next time in our show. Well, let's now take a look at how foreign direct investment into developing nations can come as both a blessing and a curse.
One of the most contentious topics when it comes to Africa is the notion of foreign direct investment. In a previous episode of Economic Divide, we discussed this issue, having looked at the Chinese economic investment into Africa. But the question that needs to be asked is whether FDI is a good or a bad thing. There's no doubt that FDI has some amazingly positive results when it comes to Africa. For a start, many African economies have grown over the last decade due to such money being invested into the nations, with investment into natural resources being a key part in the growth, with some 70% of expansion coming from this alone. But with such investment coming from foreign nations, there's a bad side to the equation, namely the opportunity for exploitation, with the lack of creation of jobs being one major factor, as much of the continent sees youth unemployment rates at around 50 to 60%, meaning that many African nations are left in a status quo that's hard to escape from. But there's also an ugly side to FDI, with corruption playing a huge part in the act, with several issues playing a part in how FDI is invested into Africa. The first is the notion that bribes have to be paid by foreign investors to gain access to niche African markets. This is something that may in fact dissuade investment into the continent. Secondly, corruption increases uncertainty, partly due to a lack of regulatory bodies fighting the corruption, and the notion that even if a bribe is paid, there's still no guarantee that a foreign investor will gain access to the market or resource. There are of course many other negative issues, but there are also some positive effects of such corruption. For one, bribes can, for example, reduce the bureaucratic paperwork involved in foreign direct investment. It can also skip inspections, taxes, and even play a part in government funding for the foreign entity. However, at the end of the day, many scholars agree that the notion of FDI is something that on the surface may appear good, yet often should be something that African nations, for one, should approach with an air of caution.
They should be careful, and in practice there tends to be quite a big difference between foreign direct investment that's going into the resource sector, like mining, oil, that type of sector, and foreign direct investment that's going into manufacturing or services like financial services, tourism. The latter type of private sector investment is generally good and beneficial.
There's a very clear reason why the rich remain rich and the poor remain poor. And this is clearly seen in the case of rich nations lending to poor nations, hence keeping them in the status quo of being forever in debt. Is it then fair that the global north has such dominance over the global south, especially in times of crises, when people are dying and fair access to medical equipment is something that should be the norm? Yet, when one takes it a layer deeper still, the exploitation continues far beyond that, with Western-imposed sanctions, for example, having a detrimental effect on the medical supplies of countries under sanctions, proving that the grip of the rich is nothing more than a method of exploitation statecraft in order to maintain their places at the top. Don't forget, you can join us on Twitter by visiting our page using the marker ed_program, and you can watch this episode and all our past episodes again by visiting our website and clicking on show. That's about all the time we have for this episode. I've been Omid Roshandel, and on behalf of myself and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you again next time.